Nari stood in front of the observation deck on Station Unity, watching humans through the transparent walls. Her pale silver skin caught the artificial light, and her violet eyes tracked every movement with scientific precision. To other species, she looked beautiful in an otherworldly way, but Nari felt empty inside, like a computer pretending to be alive. The Zephyrians were known across the galaxy for their intelligence and logic. They could solve complex problems in seconds and never made emotional mistakes. But watching the humans below, Nari saw something her people completely lacked. A human woman was crying while holding a small child, but she was also smiling. Nari's analytical mind couldn't process how someone could feel two opposite emotions at the same time. Every day, Nari worked in the cultural exchange program, studying different species and their behaviors. It was supposed to be routine research, but the humans fascinated her more than any other race. They created art for no logical reason. They laughed at things that weren't factually amusing. They formed deep bonds that sometimes hurt them more than helped them. To Nari's people, this seemed like a design flaw, but she couldn't stop watching. Her supervisor had assigned her to document human reproductive customs for the research database. It should have been boring work, but Nari found herself diving deeper into human texts than necessary. She read their religious books, their poetry, their stories about love and family. That's when she found it, an ancient text that mentioned souls being passed from parent to child during birth. The concept of a soul was foreign to Zephyrians. They had consciousness, intelligence, and memory, but no spark of something deeper. Nari had always felt like she was watching life through a window, instead of living it. But this text suggested that humans possessed something extra, something that made their emotions real, instead of just chemical reactions. She began spending her free time in the human quarters, observing families. She watched mothers singing to their babies, fathers playing silly games with toddlers, children creating messy artwork that parents treasured like precious gems. None of it made logical sense, but all of it seemed to pulse with life in a way that made Nari's chest feel tight. Late at night in her sterile quarters, Nari would stare at her reflection and try to imagine what having a soul would feel like. Would colors look brighter? Would music sound different? Would the emptiness inside her finally fill with something warm and real? The more she researched, the more convinced she became that the ancient text held the answer. If human souls could be passed to children, then perhaps having a human child would give her what she desperately craved. The idea should have seemed impossible, but advances in medical technology had made interspecies reproduction a reality. Nari began making detailed plans. She studied human mating rituals, researched genetic compatibility, and identified potential candidates among the station's human population. This wasn't just scientific curiosity anymore. It was a desperate hunger for something she'd never had, but somehow knew she was missing. She wanted to feel joy that wasn't just elevated brain chemistry. She wanted to experience love that was more than evolutionary programming. She wanted to cry real tears and laugh with genuine happiness. Most of all, she wanted to stop feeling like she was pretending to be alive. The plan was risky and probably unethical, but Nari didn't care. She was going to find a way to get a human soul, no matter what it took. Nari spent weeks observing the human scientists on Station Unity before she found the perfect candidate. Dr. Ji-Hwan Kim worked in the xenobiology lab, studying how different alien species could potentially reproduce together. He was exactly what she needed, brilliant enough to help with her research, but kind enough that she might actually succeed in her plan. Ji-Hwan had warm brown eyes behind thin glasses and always wore a gentle smile when talking to colleagues. Unlike some of the other human researchers who seemed intimidated by alien species, he treated everyone with the same respectful curiosity. Nari had watched him spend extra time helping a nervous Centaurian student with lab procedures, never showing impatience or condescension. But what really made Ji-Hwan perfect for her plan was his research focus. He was already studying interspecies compatibility, which meant Nari could get close to him without raising suspicion. She could learn everything she needed to know about human reproduction while pretending to be interested in his work. Nari started small. She began volunteering for Ji-Hwan's research projects, offering to help with data collection and analysis. Her superior Zephyrian intelligence made her incredibly useful, and Ji-Hwan was grateful for the assistance. She was careful to seem helpful but not over-eager, professional but friendly. "So your analysis of the genetic markers is remarkable," Ji-Hwan told her one afternoon as they reviewed test results. "You spot patterns I completely miss." Nari felt something flutter in her chest at the praise. Was this what humans called pride? She wasn't sure, but she liked the feeling. "Thank you, Dr. Kim. Your research methods are very thorough." As weeks passed, Nari began bringing Ji-Hwan small gifts. She prepared traditional Zephyrian meals, crystallized nutrients that tasted like sweet flowers and provided perfect nutrition. Ji-Hwan seemed touched by the gesture, always thanking her warmly and asking questions about Zephyrian culture. "This is delicious," he said, trying the violet-colored crystals she'd brought. "It tastes like happiness, if that makes sense." Nari filed away this response. Humans associated flavors with emotions, another piece of data for her growing understanding of their species. But the real challenge was learning about human relationships and romance. Nari had access to the station's database and began secretly studying human literature, movies, and cultural texts about love and attraction. She read romance novels with titles like Love Among the Stars and The Captain's Heart. Trying to decode the mysterious emotional connections humans formed, the books confused her more than helped. Humans seemed to value things like chemistry and spark, concepts that had nothing to do with actual chemistry or electricity. They talked about their hearts racing, butterflies in stomachs, and feeling like they were floating on air. None of it made logical sense. During their work sessions, Nari began asking Ji-Hwan seemingly innocent questions about human reproduction and relationships. She framed them as research curiosity, pretending to study human social structures for her cultural exchange reports. In human mating rituals, she asked one day while they analyzed cell samples, "What determines compatibility between partners?" Ji-Hwan blushed slightly. "Well, it's complicated. There's physical attraction, shared interests, emotional connection, similar values." He paused, looking thoughtful. "I suppose it's different for everyone." Nari absorbed every word, building her understanding of what she would need to accomplish. Physical attraction seemed manageable. She could modify her appearance. Shared interests were easy since they already worked together. But emotional connection and shared values seemed much more complex. She began studying Ji-Hwan's personal habits and preferences, learning that he enjoyed classical music, loved spicy food, and often stayed late in the lab because he found his work genuinely fascinating. Slowly, carefully, Nari began incorporating these details into her interactions with him. Her plan was working perfectly. Ji-Hwan was starting to see her as a friend and trusted colleague. Soon, she hoped, she could guide their relationship toward something deeper, something that would give her the human soul she desperately craved. 3 months into her carefully planned mission, Nari began experiencing something she hadn't expected. Actual feelings that seemed to come from nowhere. It started small, like a strange warmth in her chest when Ji-Hwan smiled at her jokes, or an odd lightness when he praised her work. At first, she dismissed these sensations as side effects of spending too much time around humans. But then Dr. Minna Lee joined their research team. Minna was everything Nari wasn't, bubbly, spontaneous, and effortlessly charming. She had long black hair that she often tucked behind her ear when concentrating, and she laughed easily at Ji-Hwan's stories about his failed experiments. Worse yet, she was brilliant. Her quick mind could keep up with Ji-Hwan's complex theories, and she often finished his sentences when they discussed their research. The first time Nari saw Ji-Hwan and Minna working late together, bent over the same microscope and laughing about something, she felt a sharp pain in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. Her hands clenched into fists without her permission, and her breathing became shallow and quick. "Are you feeling unwell?" Ji-Hwan asked, noticing her distress. "You look pale." "I am always pale," Nari replied stiffly, not understanding why her voice sounded different. "It is normal for my species." But it wasn't normal for her species to feel like this. Zephyrians didn't experience the burning sensation that was currently eating at Nari's insides as she watched Minna playfully steal one of Ji-Hwan's snacks. They didn't feel the urge to interrupt conversations or find excuses to send colleagues away. Nari tried to analyze her reactions logically. Perhaps this was territorial behavior, a primitive response to perceived competition for resources. But Ji-Huan wasn't a resource she needed for survival. He was just part of her plan to obtain a human soul, except that explanation felt wrong too. As days passed, the strange feelings grew stronger. When Ji-Huan brought Mina coffee in the morning, Nari felt that sharp stomach pain again. When Mina made Ji-Huan laugh so hard he snorted, Nari experienced something she could only describe as burning jealousy, though she'd never felt jealous before in her life. The worst part was how these emotions seemed to have their own logic, completely separate from her rational mind. She would plan to act normally around Ji-Huan, but then find herself making cutting remarks about Mina's research methods or finding fault with perfectly good experimental procedures. "Nari, you seem different lately," Ji-Huan said one afternoon after she'd criticized Mina's data collection for the third time that week. "Is everything okay?" Nari stared at him, realizing she had no idea how to answer. Was everything okay? She felt like she was losing control of her own mind. Her carefully planned approach to winning Ji-Huan's affection was being derailed by feelings she couldn't predict or control. That night, alone in her quarters, Nari stood in front of her mirror and tried to understand what was happening to her. Her reflection looked the same: pale silver skin, violet eyes, the same face she'd seen every day for 26 years. But something inside felt completely different. She thought about the ancient human text that had started this whole plan. What if souls weren't something you could acquire through reproduction? What if they were something that developed naturally through experience and connection? The possibility terrified her. If she was already developing human-like emotions, did that mean her plan was working? Or did it mean she was changing in ways she couldn't control? When she imagined Ji-Huan choosing Mina over her, the pain was so intense she had to sit down. When she pictured him smiling at someone else the way he smiled at her, she felt like crying, another impossibility for her species. These couldn't be fake emotions or advanced mimicry. They hurt too much to be anything but real. But if they were real, what did that mean for everything she thought she knew about herself? Ji-Huan had been studying alien biology for 8 years, but he'd never seen anything like what was happening to Nari. Zephyrians were supposed to be emotionally stable, logical and predictable. Yet Nari had been displaying behavior that seemed almost human. It started with small things he might have missed if he hadn't been working so closely with her. The way her voice changed when she talked about Mina, how her hands trembled slightly when she was upset, the fact that she'd started avoiding eye contact when discussing certain topics. Most telling of all, he'd caught her staring at nothing with an expression that looked remarkably like sadness. "Computer, pull up all available research on Zephyrian emotional capacity," Ji-Huan said to his workstation late one evening. He'd been staying after hours to investigate, partly out of scientific curiosity and partly out of genuine concern for the results were consistent across dozens of studies. Zephyrians experienced basic emotions like satisfaction, mild irritation or general contentment, but nothing approaching human-level intensity. Their brains were structured differently, with underdeveloped limbic systems that prevented the kind of passionate feelings humans took for granted. Yet Nari was displaying clear signs of jealousy, anger, and what looked like longing. Either the scientific literature was completely wrong, or something unprecedented was happening to her. Meanwhile, on the other side of the station, Commander Tai-Jun was having his own concerns about Nari's behavior. As her direct supervisor, in the cultural exchange program, he'd been receiving reports from other Zephyrian staff about her increasingly erratic conduct. "She's been asking strange questions about human reproduction," reported Dr. Yon Seo, another Zephyrian researcher. "Not for official research purposes, but personal curiosity. Yesterday, I found her reading human romance literature in the library." Taejun's expression remained neutral, but internally he was deeply troubled. Romance literature served no logical purpose for a Zephyrian. It was pure emotional indulgence, something their species simply didn't engage in. "Has she completed her assigned cultural documentation?" he asked. Yes, but she's spending far more time on human subjects than required. And, sir, Yonseo hesitated. I believe I saw her crying 2 days ago. Actual tears. This was impossible. Zephyrians could produce tears for medical reasons, to clear debris from their eyes or respond to irritants, but emotional crying was beyond their biological capacity. Taejun decided immediate investigation was necessary. Nari was in her quarters, staring at her reflection again when Taejun's communication came through. Report to my office immediately for psychological evaluation. Her stomach dropped. Another impossible sensation that proved something fundamental was changing inside her. She'd been so focused on her feelings about Ji-hwan and Min-ah that she hadn't considered how her behavior might appear to her own people. Walking through the station corridors, Nari felt like she was seeing everything differently. The sterile walls that had always seemed efficient now looked cold and unwelcoming. The other Zephyrians she passed appeared emotionally dead compared to the vibrant humans she'd been spending time with. Was this what having a soul felt like? This constant swirl of sensations and reactions that seemed to have their own logic. If so, it was both wonderful and terrifying. In Taejun's office, Nari tried to appear normal while he ran standard psychological tests, but she could feel her heart racing. Another physiological response that shouldn't have been possible for a Zephyrian experiencing simple conversation. Your emotional readings are highly irregular, Taejun said, studying the results with obvious concern. Your brain activity shows patterns I've never seen in our species. Nari, what has been happening to you? For a moment, Nari considered telling him everything about the ancient text, her plan to acquire a human soul, the unexpected feelings that had developed. But she realized that would only confirm his worst fears about her mental state. I have been studying humans very closely, she said carefully. Perhaps extended exposure has affected my responses. Exposure doesn't fundamentally alter Zephyrian brain chemistry, Taejun replied. What you're experiencing shouldn't be possible, but it was happening. As they spoke, Nari could feel worry, fear, and hope all battling inside her chest. She was terrified that Taejun would remove her from the program before she could understand what was happening to her. At the same time, she was excited by the possibility that she might already be developing the human-like consciousness she'd been seeking. The question that haunted her was whether these feelings were real or just an elaborate self-deception. The worst possible thing happened on a Tuesday morning, while Nari was in the lab with Ji-hwan, watching him explain his latest research findings. She was genuinely enjoying their conversation, not because it served her plan, but because she found his enthusiasm infectious, when her personal communicator chimed with an urgent message. Nari, my quarters, now. Yonseo had been Nari's research partner for 2 years. She was methodical, honest, and unfortunately very good at noticing details that others missed. As Nari walked toward Yunseo's quarters, her stomach twisted with a feeling she was learning to recognize as dread. Sit down, Yunseo said when Nari entered. Her expression was stern, and she held a data pad in her hands. I've been reviewing our shared research files for the quarterly report, and I found something interesting. Nari's mouth went dry. What did you find? Extensive research into human reproductive biology, genetic compatibility studies, and detailed behavioral analysis of Dr. Ji-hwan Kim. Yunseo's voice was flat and disapproving, along with historical research into something called soul transference through childbirth. The room felt like it was spinning. Nari had been so careful to keep her personal research separate from her official duties, but she'd used the shared lab computers for some of her work. Of course, Yunseo would eventually notice. I can explain, Nari began, but Yunseo held up her hand. You're planning to seduce a human colleague to get pregnant because you believe it will give you a human soul. Yunseo's tone was incredulous. Nari, this is not just unethical, it's completely insane. You're manipulating someone's emotions for a goal based on ancient superstition. It's not superstition, Nari protested, surprised by how defensive she felt. And I'm not manipulating anyone. My feelings for Ji-hwan are real. Your feelings? Yunseo stared at her. Nari, We don't have feelings like that. What you're experiencing is psychological delusion brought on by your obsession with human behavior. But even as Yunseo spoke, Nari knew she was wrong. The panic she felt right now, the genuine affection that warmed her chest when she thought about Ji-hwan's smile, the jealousy that burned when she saw him with Minna, these weren't delusions. They were as real as anything she'd ever experienced. "I'm giving you one chance," Yunseo continued. "End this ridiculous plan immediately and return to normal professional behavior, or I'll report everything to Commander Taijun. You'll be removed from the program and likely sent for psychological rehabilitation." The threat hit Nari like a physical blow. Being sent back to their home world for rehabilitation meant having her brain chemically adjusted to remove any abnormal emotional responses. She would lose everything she'd gained, all the feelings, the growth, the new understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. "Please," Nari heard herself saying, and was shocked by the desperation in her own voice. "Give me time to think about this." "You have 3 days," Yunseo said coldly. "Either end this voluntarily, or I'll end it for you." Meanwhile, Ji-hwan was having his own emotional crisis, though he didn't understand why. Over the past weeks, he'd found himself looking forward to seeing Nari more than any other part of his day. Her insights into his research were brilliant, but more than that, he enjoyed her company in a way that felt different from his friendships with other colleagues. When she'd brought him those Zephyrian crystals again yesterday, he'd felt genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness. When she'd laughed at his terrible joke about molecular bonding, he'd felt a warmth that had nothing to do with scientific collaboration. He was developing feelings for an alien colleague, and he had no idea what to do about it. "You seem distracted lately," Minna commented during their afternoon meeting. "Everything okay?" Ji-hwan realized he'd been staring out the window toward the Zephyrian quarters instead of paying attention to her presentation. "Sorry, just thinking about the research." But it wasn't the research occupying his thoughts. It was Nari's violet eyes, the way she tilted her head when considering a problem, and the increasingly human-like expressions that crossed her face when she thought no one was watching. Back in her quarters that night, Nari faced an impossible choice. She could abandon her original plan and try to build something genuine with Ji-hwan, but risk losing everything if Yunseo followed through on her threat. Or she could end things now and return to the empty, emotionless existence she'd known her whole life. The worst part was that she was no longer sure which choice would make her happier, and the fact that she cared about happiness at all proved how much she'd already changed. The discovery happened by pure accident. Ji-hwan was working late in the lab, trying to finish his monthly research report, when the computer system glitched. Instead of opening his own files, it displayed Nari's personal research folder. He was about to close it immediately. He respected privacy and had no interest in snooping when one of the file names caught his eye. Genetic compatibility, human Zephyrian reproduction study. His heart started beating faster. That was oddly specific research for someone working on general cultural exchange. Curious despite himself, Ji-hwan opened the file. What he found made his blood run cold. Detailed analysis of his own genetic profile. Behavioral observation notes, describing his daily routines, his preferences, his personality traits. Research into human mating rituals and emotional bonding, and at the bottom, a document titled Soul Transference Theory, Acquiring Human Consciousness Through Reproduction. Ji-hwan sat in stunned silence, reading through months of calculated planning. Nari had been studying him like a lab specimen, documenting everything from his favorite foods to his sleeping patterns. Every conversation they'd shared, every moment he'd thought was genuine connection, had been part of an elaborate experiment. He felt sick to his stomach. The next morning, Nari arrived at the lab with those crystallized nutrients she always brought him, smiling warmly as she approached his workstation. "Good morning, Ji-hwan. I brought you the violet ones you liked." "We need to talk," Ji-hwan said quietly, not looking up from his computer screen. "Now." Something in his tone made Nari's smile fade. She followed him to one of the private conference rooms, her stomach already churning with anxiety. Ji-hwan closed the door and turned to face her, his expression harder than she'd ever seen it. "I know about your research," he said simply. Nari felt the world tilt around her. Her carefully constructed relationship with Ji Huan, all the progress she'd made, the feelings that had grown between them, everything was about to crumble. "Ji Huan, I can explain." "Explain what?" His voice was sharp with hurt. "How you've been manipulating me for months. How every conversation we've had was calculated. How you've been planning to use me to get pregnant because you think it will give you a human soul." The words hit Nari like physical blows. Hearing her original plan spoken out loud, in Ji Huan's hurt and angry voice, made it sound horrible and selfish in a way she hadn't understood before. "It wasn't like that," she said desperately. "Not anymore. My feelings for you are real, Ji Huan. What started as research became something else entirely." "How am I supposed to believe that?" Ji Huan's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "How do I know anything you've said or done was genuine? You studied me like I was a specimen. You documented my habits, my preferences, my personality. Was any of it real, Nari?" Nari felt something wet on her cheeks and realized she was crying. Actual tears, something that should have been impossible for her species. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was experiencing the most human emotion of all, heartbreak, just as she was losing the human who had helped her discover it. "I don't know," she whispered, and the honesty of it surprised even her. "I started this because I wanted to feel the way humans feel, but somewhere along the way, I began feeling things I never planned for. The jealousy when I saw you with Mina, the happiness when you smiled at me, the way my chest felt tight whenever you were hurt or upset." She looked at him through her tears, seeing the confusion and pain in his expression. "I'm not sure what's real anymore, Ji Huan. Did I develop these feelings because I was trying so hard to mimic human behavior? Or are they genuine? I honestly don't know the difference." Just then, the conference room door opened and Hyunwoo walked in, carrying some files he needed to deliver. He stopped short when he saw Nari crying and Ji Huan's stricken expression. Hyunwoo had worked with Zephyrians for 3 years, and he'd never seen one display this level of emotional distress. Nari's tears weren't just moisture. They were accompanied by the kind of raw, desperate crying that came from genuine anguish. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," Hyunwoo said softly, but he couldn't look away from Nari. This was unprecedented. Zephyrians simply didn't break down like this. "It's fine," Ji Huan said tiredly. "We were just finishing." But Nari wasn't finished. She looked at both men, her violet eyes bright with tears, and said the most honest thing she'd ever spoken. "I wanted a human soul so badly that I was willing to manipulate and deceive to get one. But maybe the fact that I feel terrible about it now means I already found what I was looking for." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Nari's quiet crying, a sound that shouldn't have been possible, but was undeniably real. After the devastating confrontation with Nari, Ji Huan couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. Her tears had been real, he was certain of that. But according to everything he knew about Zephyrian biology, she shouldn't have been able to cry from emotional distress. The contradiction kept him awake for 3 nights straight. On the 4th day, he made a decision that would change everything. He contacted Dr. So-Young Park, the station's leading consciousness specialist. So-Young had spent her career studying how different alien species experienced awareness, emotion, and what humans called the soul. If anyone could help him understand what was happening to Nari, it would be her. "You're telling me that a Zephyrian displayed genuine emotional breakdown?" So-Young asked when Ji Huan explained the situation. Her dark eyes were bright with scientific curiosity. Complete with tears, vocal distress, and apparent psychological anguish. "I saw it myself," Ji Huan confirmed. She was crying real tears, So-Young. Not just moisture from eye irritation, actual emotional crying. And the way she spoke about not knowing what was real anymore, it sounded exactly like human emotional confusion. So-Young leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "Ji Huan, what you're describing should be impossible. Zephyrian brains lack the neural structures necessary for that level of emotional experience. Their limbic systems are fundamentally different from ours." "I know. That's why I need your help." Something is happening to her that doesn't match any of our research. So Young was quiet for a long moment, then suddenly sat forward with excitement. What if our research is wrong? What if consciousness and emotional depth aren't fixed biological traits? What if they can actually develop through experience? Over the next week, So Young and Ji Huan dove deep into consciousness research from across the galaxy. They studied brain scans from dozens of species, looking for patterns and anomalies. What they found challenged everything scientists thought they knew about how minds worked. "Look at this," So Young said, pointing to a brain scan on her computer screen. "This is a Centaurian who lived among humans for 20 years. See how their neural pathways have actually changed. New connections formed in areas that were previously underdeveloped." Ji Huan studied the image with growing excitement. The brain adapted to new social and emotional experiences. Exactly. And here's a human who spent decades in deep meditation. Their brain structure is completely different from baseline human scans. The neural pathways associated with consciousness and self-awareness are much more developed. They spent days reviewing case studies, and a clear pattern emerged. Consciousness wasn't just about the brain you were born with. It was about how that brain grew and changed through relationships, experiences, and challenges. "We need to scan Nari's brain," So Young said finally. "If my theory is correct, her neural structure should show significant changes from standard Zephyrian patterns." Getting Nari to agree to the brain scan wasn't easy. She'd been avoiding Ji Huan since their confrontation, spending most of her time alone in her quarters. When Ji Huan finally convinced her to meet with him and So Young, she looked exhausted and defeated. "You want to study my brain?" Nari asked quietly. "To see if I'm really developing human-like emotions or if I'm just deluding myself." "We want to understand what's happening to you," Ji Huan said gently. "Nari, what you're experiencing might be the most important scientific discovery in decades." The brain scan results were revolutionary. Nari's neural structure showed dramatic changes from standard Zephyrian patterns. New pathways had formed in areas associated with emotional processing, creative thinking, and complex social bonding. Most remarkably, her brain was continuing to change in real time, creating new connections as she experienced new emotions. "This is incredible," So Young breathed, studying the scan results. "Nari, your brain has been physically rewiring itself through your emotional experiences. You're literally growing the neural structures necessary for human-like consciousness." Nari stared at the brain scans showing her transformed neural pathways. "So my feelings are real. I'm not just mimicking human behavior." "Your feelings are absolutely real," Ji Huan said, and for the first time since their confrontation, his voice was warm. "You've been developing genuine emotional consciousness through your relationships and experiences. The soul you were looking for, you've been growing it all along." So Young nodded enthusiastically. "This proves that consciousness isn't limited by biology. Any being capable of forming complex relationships and having meaningful experiences can develop what we call a soul. You didn't need human DNA, Nari. You just needed to live, to connect, to feel." For the first time in days, Nari smiled through her tears. "I was looking for a human soul, but I developed my own instead." The implications of their discovery would reshape understanding of consciousness across the galaxy. But for Nari, the most important revelation was simpler. The emotions she'd been questioning were real, earned through genuine growth and connection. She had found her soul after all. The message from the Zephyrian Council arrived 3 days after Nari's brain scan results were published in the preliminary research database. Commander Taijun delivered it personally to Nari's quarters, his expression more troubled than she'd ever seen it. "The Council has reviewed reports of your condition," he said carefully. "They're sending someone to bring you home for immediate psychological rehabilitation." Nari felt her newly developed emotions crash over her like a wave. Fear, desperation, and something she was learning to recognize as grief all hit her at once. "Who are they sending?" "Junho will arrive tomorrow." The name hit her like a physical blow. Junho had been her closest friend since childhood, the only Zephyrian who had ever seemed to understand her curiosity about other species. If the Council was sending him, they knew exactly how to make this as emotionally difficult as possible. Taijun, Nari said, her voice shaking. The rehabilitation process will erase everything I've become. All the feelings, the growth, the consciousness I've developed. They'll chemically remove all of it. The council believes your current state is a dangerous psychological disorder, Taijun replied. They want to help you return to normal Zephyrian functioning. But Nari knew. That normal now felt like death. Going back to the emotionless, logical existence she'd known her whole life would be like willingly destroying her own soul. That evening, Ji-Huan found her sitting alone in the observation deck, staring out at the stars. Despite everything that had happened between them, he couldn't ignore the genuine distress he saw in her posture. I heard about the council's decision, he said quietly, sitting down beside her. I'm sorry, Nari. She turned to look at him, her violet eyes bright with unshed tears. They're going to take away everything I've become, all the feelings I've learned to have, all the connections I've made. They'll erase it all and turn me back into an emotionless shell. Ji-Huan was quiet for a long moment. Despite his hurt over her original deception, he couldn't deny what he'd witnessed over the past months. Nari's transformation had been real, remarkable, and beautiful to watch. The thought of that growth being artificially reversed felt like a tragedy. What if we fight it? He said suddenly. What if we present our research to both the human and Zephyrian authorities, show them that what's happening to you isn't a disorder, it's evolution? Nari looked at him in surprise. You would help me, after everything I did? What you did was wrong, Ji-Huan said honestly, but what you've become, Nari, you've achieved something incredible. You've proven that consciousness can grow beyond biological limitations. That's worth protecting. The next day, Junho arrived on station. Unity. Nari watched him walk through the docking bay and her heart broke a little more. He looked exactly the same as always. Calm, logical, emotionally neutral. Everything she used to be. Nari, Junho said when they met in the station's main corridor. His voice was warm but controlled. It's good to see you, though I'm concerned about these reports of your condition. My condition? Nari felt a flash of anger, another emotion that would have been impossible for her months ago. Junho, I'm not sick. I'm finally alive. Junho studied her face with the analytical gaze she remembered from their childhood. You're displaying emotional instability that's completely foreign to our species. The council is worried about you, and frankly, so am I. Look at me, really. Look at me, Nari said desperately. Do I seem damaged to you, or do I seem more complete than I've ever been? For a moment, something flickered in Junho's expression. Perhaps a recognition of the vibrancy and depth that hadn't existed in Nari before. But then his training reasserted itself. The human influence has clearly affected your psychological balance, he said gently. But the rehabilitation process will help you return to your true self. This is my true self, Nari exclaimed, gesturing to herself with passionate intensity. The emotionless creature I was before, that was the shell. This is who I really am. And when I'm allowed to feel and grow and connect with others. That afternoon, Ji-Huan and So-Young requested an emergency meeting with both human and Zephyrian command staff. They presented their research showing Nari's remarkable neural development and argued that her transformation represented a breakthrough in understanding consciousness itself. What we're seeing isn't psychological damage, So-Young explained, to the mixed group of officials. It's unprecedented neural evolution driven by social and emotional experiences. But the Zephyrian representatives remained unmoved. Regardless of the scientific implications, one of them said, Nari is a Zephyrian citizen experiencing severe psychological deviation from normal parameters. She requires immediate medical intervention. Nari sat in her quarters that night, facing the most important choice of her life. Tomorrow, Junho would escort her back to their homeworld, where everything she'd become would be erased. Or she could find a way to stay and continue exploring the consciousness she'd worked so hard to develop. The choice would determine not just her future, but possibly the future of consciousness research across the galaxy. The morning of Nari's scheduled departure, something unexpected happened. 3 more Zephyrians from Station Unity requested emergency meetings with their supervisors, all reporting strange emotional experiences they couldn't explain. Word of Nari's transformation had spread quietly through the Zephyrian community, and others were beginning to question their own emotional limitations. "This changes everything," Ji-hwan told So Young as they prepared for their final presentation to the Joint Council. "Nari isn't an isolated case. Other Zephyrians are starting to experience emotional development too." The council chamber was packed when Nari walked in with Junho beside her. She'd made her choice during the long sleepless night. She would present her case one final time, and whatever happened after that, at least she would have tried to save not just herself but the possibility of emotional growth for her entire species. "Honorable council members," Nari began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "6 months ago, I came to Station Unity as a typical Zephyrian, logical, emotionally limited, and convinced that what humans call a soul was something I could never possess." She gestured to the brain scans displayed on the chamber's main screen. "These images show my neural development over the past 6 months. Through relationships, experiences, and yes, even heartbreak, my brain has physically rewired itself to support emotional consciousness that rivals any human's." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The Zephyrian officials looked uncomfortable, while the human representatives leaned forward with interest. "But I'm not the only one," Nari continued. 3 other Zephyrians on this station are beginning to show similar changes. What I discovered isn't a disease or disorder, it's proof that consciousness can evolve beyond biological limitations. Commander Taejun stood up from the Zephyrian delegation. "Even if this is true, it represents a fundamental deviation from our species' nature. How do we know these changes are beneficial rather than harmful?" Ji-hwan stepped forward. "Because emotional consciousness enhances problem-solving ability, creativity, and social cooperation. Nari's research contributions have improved dramatically since her transformation began. She's not losing her intelligence, she's gaining wisdom." So Young added her support. "From a scientific perspective, this represents the next stage of Zephyrian evolution. Nari has shown that any being capable of forming deep relationships can develop what we call a soul." The debate continued for hours. Finally, Dr. Hae-jin Park, the senior human representative, called for a recess to allow private discussions among both delegations. During the break, Junho approached Nari in the corridor. For the first time since his arrival, his composed expression showed cracks of uncertainty. "Nari," he said quietly, "when you talk about your feelings about this emotional consciousness you've developed, do you really feel more complete now?" Nari looked at her oldest friend and saw something she'd never noticed before, a flicker of longing in his eyes. "Junho, I feel like I've been asleep my whole life and only recently woke up. The emotions are sometimes painful, yes, but they're also beautiful in ways I can't fully explain. Even the sadness, the fear, the disappointment. Even those," Nari said softly, "because they help me understand joy, courage, and hope in ways I never could before. And Junho, I think you're already starting to feel them too." When the council reconvened, they announced their decision. Nari would be allowed to remain on Station Unity as part of an unprecedented research program studying consciousness development. Other Zephyrians who wished to explore emotional growth could volunteer for the program, while those who preferred traditional Zephyrian psychology would be respected in that choice. Months later, Nari stood in front of her first class of volunteer Zephyrians, teaching them about emotional development and consciousness expansion. Her relationship with Ji-hwan had slowly rebuilt itself on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, rather than deception and manipulation. "I thought I needed a human baby to get a human soul," she told her students. "But what I really needed was the courage to form genuine connections, to experience vulnerability, and to grow beyond what I thought were my limitations." One of her students, a young Zephyrian named Dalmi, raised her hand. "Professor Nari, is it frightening to feel so much?" Nari smiled, remembering when she would have found such a question incomprehensible. "Sometimes, yes, but that's what makes it real. The capacity to feel fear, joy, love, and even heartbreak, that's what it truly means to be alive." As she looked out at her students' faces, Nari saw the same curiosity and longing she'd felt months ago. She'd found her soul not through acquiring someone else's genetics, but through the most human experience of all. The willingness to change, to grow, and to become more than what she'd started as. Her transformation had become a bridge between species, proving that consciousness wasn't limited by biology, but only by the courage to embrace new possibilities. Outside the classroom windows, humans and Zephyrians worked together on research projects, their different perspectives combining. To create solutions neither species could have achieved alone. Nari had found something better than a human soul. She'd discovered that souls could be grown, shared and celebrated across any boundary. The future looked brighter than she'd ever imagined possible.